So I get requests from Not a Giraffe and Kit Doctor to make a Dark Machamp deck. And this is a card I had never used in a deck. I couldn't even really remember what its second attack even did. So let's take a look at this card. The first attack, you know, that's a pretty decent haymaker, but really what they wanted to see from this deck was utilization of that fling attack, which can be very disruptive since your opponent has to shuffle their active and all cards attached to it back into their deck. But there's some major problems here. The attack costs 4 energy, which is preposterous. If it was 3, this card would be much better and a little more usable, especially considering it only has 70 HP for a stage 2, which is a problem that all of the Dark Rocket cards share. But the biggest problem in making this card work is that you can't use Fling as a win condition, so you can't fling an opponent's active back into their deck and win the game, because if they have no bench Pokemon, that attack does nothing. So you really have to cover for, well, how do you win the game after you flung your opponent's Pokemon back into their deck? Are you just going to Mega Punch whatever they pull out as their next active and hope that they don't lay anything else down? No, that doesn't quite work either. But then I remembered I've done a deck like this before that did have a win condition where you could basically fling your opponent's Pokemon away. Oh my god, I never thought I would be using this card in a deck again, but upon looking at Dark Machamp, I realized it's just a worse version of Pidgeot, so why not pair the two together and see how they work out. Dark Machamp is better suited to flinging away big basics like Chansey. That way your opponent can't just immediately lay them right back down next turn, while Pidgeot's Hurricane attack is better suited for evolution cards. That way you can Hurricane them back to your opponent's hand, and they can't just go ahead and play all 3 stages of an evolution next turn. Plus, there are other ways to mess around with your opponent's hand to make sure that those evolution cards aren't readily available to them. Spoiler alert, this is not a very competitive deck. It's more of a really gimmicky, just for fun deck. So now that you get the general ideas, let's look at the build. With the core attacks of this deck costing 3 or 4 energy, you are really going to need Cleffa to really stall out for those first few turns and really get your setup going. Go ahead and get those evolution cards built up as fast as you can with some focus bands on them, because your opponent is going to have Gust or Double Gust. Going to be able to swap those out really quick and take them down easily since they do have low HP. Going to be using the Machamp from base set because its attack is so useful. You can low kick for 1 energy, deal a decent little chip of damage, put some pressure on whatever your opponent's active is if you have to start the game with a Machamp for some reason. I'll be running a 3-2-3 build with the 2 evolution lines in this deck. So I've got 2 Dark Machoke in here. Both of its attacks do have some synergy with Dark Machamp, as they can kind of push Pokemon back to the bench or pull new targets off of the bench and deal damage to them. But since those attacks cost 3 damage and Dark Machoke only has 60 HP, you're not going to be using it very much. Ideally, you're going to be able to get a Pokemon breeder in time to go straight from Machamp into Dark Machamp, get a focus band on there, and start loading energy, and hope that you can keep those energy on Dark Machamp long enough to even use its Fling attack. If you can actually get the energy for a Fling, it can be pretty satisfying. So, say your opponent has set up a Steel Chance. It's got a couple of Steel energy on it, a double colorless, probably a Gold Berry. If you can fling that back into their deck, you've just ruined 3 turns of setup for them, even though it's probably taken you 4. But still, like I mentioned earlier, 3-2-3 line of Pidgeot as well, using that base set Pidgey. A completely forgettable card. This is another one where I couldn't even remember what its attack was. I look at this card so little. But Whirlwind isn't bad if you can get that double colorless down on there. Pidgeot is going to be your primary attacker probably, at least initially, since getting 3 colorless energy onto Pidgeot's a lot easier than getting basically 4 fighting energy onto a Dark Machamp. A lot of your early game trainers are going to be better suited towards Pidgeot anyway, since they are dealing with messing around with your opponent's hand. Dark Machamp's really going to be a more late game savior, with Pidgeot doing the cleanup at the very end. So starting and ending the games with Pidgeot, making a nice Dark Machamp sandwich. It does help that Pidgeot has a free retreat cost, so you can pull right back out of that strategy and go straight into Dark Machamp as soon as it's set up. You've also got Gust of Wind, which is going to be more of a stall card instead of a knockout card like it's usually used in this format. And then also Double Gust, because Dark Machamp does have such a high retreat cost. If you really need to swap out quickly, you're gonna have to use a Double Gust in here. I didn't include any copies of Switch because there are 6 copies of Gust in here basically. And since this deck is a whole lot of stall, a whole lot of control, I thought there's no better trainer base to back it up than Trapper. So I got 4 copies of Rocket Sneak Attack in here. That's going to let you look at your opponent's hand, and if they've got a trainer that you don't like, you send it right back into their deck. Plays in very nicely with the Fling and the Hurricane attacks, especially Hurricane, since you can send a Pokemon back to your opponent's hand. Play Imposter's Oak Revenge on your next turn to make sure a lot of the cards that may have been attached to it go right back into your opponent's deck. After the Oak's Revenge, you're going to play Rocket Sneak Attack, and hopefully one of those 4 cards they have in their hand is a trainer that's going to go back in too, so you're really limiting what they can do during their turn. Since this deck does need a lot of energy on Pokemon, you want to try to avoid energy removals as much as you can, so using this Trapper build is a great way to keep those out of your opponent's hand. You could also run Lass, but I really like the Trapper setup for this deck a lot better because you are going to have a lot of trainers in your hand that you kind of need to hold on to, like your Gust and Double Gust, as well as Pokemon Breeder, because you need those evolution cards in your hand too. So using Lass is very limiting for this deck. You'll also notice there's no Professor Oak, no Professor Elm, no Item Finder, no Computer Search. Not a whole lot of search in this deck, which is another reason you're really going to have to rely on those Clefas to really get your setup. If you really think that this build needs those cards, which they could use it, you can take out the 2 Machokes and the 2 Pidgeotos all together and try to include a bigger trainer base to get some more search options going. But then you have to worry about getting those breeders very quickly and hoping that your breeders don't get discarded out of your hand before you can use them by your opponent's Lass or your opponent's Rocket Sneak Attack. Narrow Gem is going to be a huge help for this deck, as it's going to make sure that you're not getting overwhelmed by your opponent's active Amulets on their bench. That way you can really utilize Fling and Hurricane as much as possible and limit your opponent in what they can do. They're forced to take their entire setup to the limited Pokemon they do have on their bench, while you're going to be just sending those right back into their deck or right back into their hand. And filling out the rest of the deck with Fighting Energy. Another huge limitation of this deck is it needs a lot of energy to function. And Double Colorless doesn't help completely, as you can only use those on the Pidgeot. Dark Machamp would be so much more usable if it could utilize the Double Colorless. But because you have to include so much energy in this deck, that's also going to limit the amount of trainers you can use in this deck. That's why there's not any Professor cards. That's why there's not any Computer Searches, because I really needed that space in this deck for the Fighting Energy. And even then, I still don't think there's enough Fighting Energy in here. This is really assuming that you're going to be able to control your opponent's energy removals, because if you get hit with a full playset of those, it's going to be really hard to get these limited Fighting Energy out of your deck and onto Machamp. That way you can use Fling, which is hard enough anyway. On a side note, I'm really glad that I fixed the glare issue with my camera and lighting setup. Look at all these beautiful cards spread out. You can see all of them. Oh man, it's splendid. I've already mentioned a couple of alternate cards you may want to fit into this deck, like a Computer Search or a Lass, but if you want to go full Trapper on this, you can go ahead and include some copies of Erica. It's a great card to use right before you use an Imposter Oak's Revenge, and it also makes up for the lack of Professor Oak or Elm in this deck, so you're going to be able to draw cards and benefit from keeping those in your hand, while you're just going to play an Imposter Oak's Revenge and force your opponent to go back down to a hand size of 4. To keep the reshuffle madness going, you could even combo Imposter Oak with Imposter Oak, although the regular Imposter Oak is not as good as Imposter Oak's Revenge. But to backtrack a little, the biggest limitation of this deck is that you cannot win the game by using Fling. Fling is a very powerful attack, as it can ruin your opponent's entire setup, multiple turns of setup, and throw it right back into your opponent's deck, and from there you can control their hand size with the trainers in this deck. To meet this win condition, you have to have Pidgeot to come in and clean up at the end of the game and Hurricane your opponent's last Pokemon back into their hand, which will win you the game, but it's going to be very difficult to do. A lot of games that I play tested ended up with wins from this deck, but only because I stalled out my opponent until maybe like their last prize card, and they couldn't actually take it in time, as I kept ruining their setup by using Hurricane or Fling to the point where they could rarely get off attacks and they couldn't win the game off of just trainers, so it came down to deck out. But more importantly, I posed the question, where do Machamp's underpants come from? They seem like clothing, much like the belt, but what are they actually? Are they just part of Machamp? Are those a biological feature of this Pokemon? I can buy into the fact that Tangela's feet just happen to look exactly like shoes, and that they're not actually shoes, but this one has always bugged me. When it goes Gigantamax, that coloration extends down its legs to make it look like pants, but they don't have a clear cutoff, so it seems like that's just Machamp's skin, and that belt is also somehow just part of its skin? I don't know. I will come back to resolve this mystery in a later video. If you enjoy seeing Pokemon TCG content like you just saw in this video, make sure you go ahead and subscribe. If you'd like to follow me on Instagram, you can do so at DrunkShuckle. Let me know down in those comments what you think about this deck. Let me know what your request decks are so I can start deck building on those. Look forward to a lot more decks coming soon, as well as some additional content about vintage Pokemon TCG. And until next time, bye.